I'll leave. Hello.
Hey, Chris, thanks for coming on. Appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Oh, yes, please. Probably the most relevant thing to start with is actually where you and I met, which was the ISCAST conference here in Sydney about 3 months ago. I don't know if you've talked about that on your channel before at all.
I believe so.
Yeah. So ISCAST, an organization here in Australia that are kind of like science and Christianity in conversation. So a bunch of professional scientists who are also Christians talking about science and Christianity. I only found out about them last year, and so I thought I'd go to their conference. It was fun and interesting. But yeah, so my background is I'm a mathematician by training. I'm currently working in statistical programming, and obviously I'm also a Christian, and currently on this in my spare time writing a book about, well, the working title is Truth in the 21st Century, about truth politics in our current day, as well as new atheism and Christian nationalism. So, just some really light topics.
Sure. So my typical starting point is I say something like, I don't believe there's any arguments or evidence that indicate the existence of God more so than naturalism. Do you believe there are such cases, and what would they be?
Arguments or evidence that indicate the existence of God more so than naturalism? I would actually say no, right? So I think, the atheist naturalistic worldview is a valid, consistent worldview, just as the Christian worldview is a valid, consistent worldview. And, I have a whole lot of reasons for structuring my life around the Christian worldview. I have personal issues with the naturalistic worldview. I think it does lead to kind of a bit of nihilism that I wouldn't be able to cope with in my life, and so I didn't find it a coherent answer for the world that we live in. But a lot of my friends are atheists, and a lot of them are comfortable with an ultimate nihilism that comes from atheism, and that I don't understand it, but that's fine. So yeah, I don't think that there are knockout arguments for God that completely dismiss naturalism, because naturalism is a coherent worldview based on the evidence we have at hand. But I also think Christianity is also a coherent worldview based on the evidence that we have at hand. Yeah. I don't know if you would agree with that position, or if you would kind of... Do you think Christianity is a coherent worldview?
It depends what you mean by coherent. How would you define a coherent worldview?
Do you think it's plausible?
Plausible in that, I guess, how would I answer that? Because I think it's arguable that there are logical contradictions with the idea of a God. I think it's more important that I don't think that there's any way to justifiably believe that there is a unembodied mind outside of the universe. I don't think that can be supported by any evidence.
Yeah.
So in that sense, I think there would be, I don't think it's contradictory, but I would say that it was probably something that wouldn't be a rational conclusion based on the evidence. Whereas I think naturalism, you could argue, is a rational conclusion based on the evidence.
Right. I think I see what you're getting. And I agree that, like, based on naturalistic evidence, you can't prove a supernatural mind behind the universe, because that's just like you're using the wrong tools in a sense. Naturalistic evidence can only prove naturalistic things about the universe that we live in. It can prove a lot of those things. So in terms of how did the universe come to be, we actually know the answer to a lot of those questions. But in terms of why does the universe exist at all? You know, you can't really use naturalistic evidence to answer that question, if that makes sense. So the idea that you can't prove that there's some sort of mind behind the universe, like, yeah, no, you can't prove that. It's just, yeah.
Well, is there? I would say the same thing would apply to any form of evidence. Is there another kind of evidence that you think could indicate that in a more substantiable way?
I mean, yes. So I'm gonna, at this point, kind of separate out, like, there's almost kind of two big steps that I take to where I am in my worldview, right? So there's the first step of, like, is Christianity plausible? Is atheism plausible? You know, could they possibly be true? What evidence do we have? And essentially where I come to in that question is that the evidence we have says that they're both plausible worldviews. And then, you know, that's based on all of the kind of naturalistic evidence that we have about the universe around us, and what may or may not be, you know, the laws of physics or anything else acting on our universe. And then there's a separate question of, okay, we've got these two worldviews, naturalism versus Christianity. How well do each of these explain my experience of this world? Right? So, you know, I think from just a pure kind of naturalistic reading of the evidence, you can get to a point where these are two valid worldviews. You could argue whether one's more valid than the other, but I think it's at least comparable. And then I start to do this comparison of, okay, well, how well does naturalism explain my experience of the world? And I quickly get to a point where, you know, not all of my atheist friends get to this point, but I quickly get to a point of, okay, well, if the universe is entirely naturalistic and there is no purpose behind it, like, if it's entirely naturalistic, there's nothing outside of it, then there's no purpose to this universe. And then I'm like, well, what's the point? It makes no sense to me. Whereas, you know, I look at the person of Jesus Christ, I look at his life, death, I look at the historical evidence we have for his resurrection, which is not, it's not like conclusive at all. Like, I'm not going to make an argument that you can historically, scientifically prove that Jesus rose from the dead. But I look at the historical evidence we have, and I think that that was at least a plausible interpretation of the evidence we have that he was resurrected, that the people who claimed he was resurrected actually saw what they claimed to see. And then I kind of look at the rest of the Christian worldview, and oh gosh, it's so hard to distill, because really it's the last kind of 10-15 years of my life of the way that being a Christian has shaped my life that really proves to me that it must be true. And that's not something that you can very quickly articulate. But yeah, that's kind of where I'm at.
So yeah, my question would be, in what way, in what I think of as evidence is, how do you differentiate imagination from reality? How does the fact that it can make sense of your life in any way show that it's not imaginary? Because you can have things make sense of your life and be completely false. Stories are a very common way to make sense of the world when you don't understand
Mm-hmm.
it. Like Thor, someone could essentially say the same thing about how Thor makes sense of lightning, and that
Mm.
nothing else makes sense of lightning, and the naturalist idea doesn't have anything right now. So
Mm.
why would we take that as a piece of evidence that is like really significant? The fact that it makes sense to someone intuitively, or
Mm.
can explain parts about their life that there isn't a current explanation for naturally. That just
Mm.
seems like one of those arguments from ignorance. We don't know, therefore God kind of a thing.
Right. Um, I see what you're getting at. We actually kind of do the same thing with science. Like, in a way, that's how science work. We have two different stories. For example, the gods of antiquity, of Thor explaining lightning, and then we have a new story, meteorology and all of the um, mathematics behind that. And you look at, okay, which one explains the world more completely, and does it also make predictions about other things that can be used, that can be tested to validate or invalidate the new model. So for example, you've got the when heliocentrism, Copernicus and Galileo really came up with, like, started to push that model. It was challenging the geocentrist model. The reason heliocentrism won the day is because it explained, it made predictions about the movements of celestial bodies that people could then go and observe through telescopes and be like, oh, this actually aligns with the heliocentric model of the universe, so I'm going to use this as evidence towards the heliocentric model of the universe. And you can actually kind of do a similar thing with religion. Not in quite the same way, not with the same level of mathematical or scientific rigor, but you can say, you can compare the nihilistic model of the naturalistic model of the universe that says there is no purpose, and use that to predict how humans will behave, or how social structures form, and all of that. Or you can kind of you can do the same thing with the Christian worldview. And, like, in just from my experience of being a Christian, like, the story of human sin, of humans made in the image of God, you've got this deep sacredness, but also this deep brokenness. um I'm struggling to come up with examples, but just walking through my life, I have seen these sorts of things that I encounter an example of something happening in my life, and it actually, the Christian worldview helps to explain that in the same way that a heliocentric model of the universe helps to explain movements that people observe in the stars. Yeah.
Well, that would be the hypothesis section of the theory. So I have an explanation of this new data,
Mm.
but that wouldn't be justification for believing that it's true. You would need another step. You'd say predictions usually. So like heliocentrism, there
Mm.
are contradictions, like the shadows on Venus. If um, the Earth if everything goes around the Earth,
Mm.
then it would never be the case that you would see like the a full shadow or no shadow on the full front of Venus, because
Mm-hmm.
it's impossible to get to that view if you're going around the Earth. Whereas if you're going around the Sun, then the Earth and can be behind Venus and you can see the full shadow or whatever. And so there are actual differences in predictions that um, show one would be correct and one would be incorrect. Like falsifiability kind of a thing. And so it wouldn't just be that they explain the data differently. It's like the same data, they just explain different things. It's more that they have different data they explain, which can be verified and shown that one is correct and one is incorrect. And so that I wouldn't see as analogous. And that's why like heliocentrism was accepted, was because it was confirmed to be correct with the data. Whereas in the case of God versus naturalism.
Hello?
Oh, can you hear me still? Testing.
Was that my internet or was that yours?
I don't know.
I don't know. It was one of ours. Anyway, hello again.
Yes. Okay.
Sorry, you were. Yeah.
Yeah. So, in the case of heliocentrism, they make conflicting predictions which can be observed, and that's why heliocentrism was selected for over the geocentric model, was because it made correct predictions of the data, whereas the other one didn't. Whereas theism versus atheism doesn't necessarily do that. Another thing I wanted to comment on was the purposefulness. Naturalism doesn't say there is or is not purposefulness in the universe. There can still be purposefulness in a naturalistic universe. And so that would be another example of what seems like a God of the gaps, in the sense that you think God provides an explanation of purposefulness, whereas naturalism doesn't. But it doesn't say there isn't any. And so that would be like a claim saying, well, because naturalism doesn't provide an explanation for this, therefore God, kind of a thing. And so I don't think that naturalism precludes purposefulness. And so I don't know why that would be a point for theism as opposed to naturalism.
Okay. So I'll start with the heliocentrism one, and you might have to remind me of the other point in a minute, because my short-term memory is not always the best. So you spoke about how my kind of comparison of comparing heliocentrism to geocentrism doesn't quite work when it comes to religion. And I think in a sense that's right. In that when it comes to, scientific predictions, scientific models, we can devise experiments to test them, right? That's kind of the whole point of science. We can't do that with religion. I mentioned I'm writing a book. Kind of the main thesis that I'm trying to argue in that book is to explain what I categorize as natural truth, which is those things that can be objectively measured, those truth claims which can be objectively measured, and then spiritual truth, which is kind of anything that can't be objectively measured. So, morality, philosophy, the existence of God, all of those sorts of things. And so when it comes to, natural truth claims, a lot of those can be experimentally tested. But when it comes to spiritual truth claims, when it comes to competing two different understandings of, like, the spiritual purpose behind the universe, or whatever you want to call it, two different religious worldviews, there isn't actually an experimental way to test those. You kind of just have to experience them. You kind of just have to go through life, and then as we have life experiences, you kind of test those. You test the worldviews, those truth claims, that way, and that's how most of us go through life as humans. Like we all do that. We all are constantly validating or testing our experiences against our own worldviews, and then obviously you get into all of the biases things, but that's a whole other topic. Yeah, I don't know if you have thoughts on that, if you wanted to remind me of the other question.
The purposefulness in naturalism.
Oh, yes. So I know I know what you're saying. Naturalism doesn't necessarily imply purposelessness, although, like, I know people who have argued that point. I just personally have never really been able to understand it. So the logic as it goes in my mind is that, you know, if I guess it's kind of like, if this universe has no external purpose for existing, like I think naturalism implies that this universe has no external purpose for existing. And I think any force, entity, thing that could give the universe purpose from external would fall into the category of God. Yeah. So
Well, it seems like you're implying that you need to have an external purpose for it to be true purpose or something along those lines.
Right. So that I think that logic is fairly sound. Where I end up disagreeing with my atheist friends is that for a lot of my atheist friends, they say, yeah, that's fine. Then I have to make my own purpose here in this universe.
Well,
Where
I would want to disagree with that argument.
Okay.
Because like, does God have a purpose outside of himself?
I don't know. I so this is your classic paradox of ultimate creation, where you either have to have something created out of nothing with no purpose or unexplained purpose, or an infinite regress of things that create each other. It's turtles all the way down. And I always struggled with that paradox, and the way that I am personally most comfortable with resolving it is to say that I am comfortable with God as I understand him, the Christian God, existing without an explanation of the purpose of his existence.
Well,
I find that more sorry?
Well, that leads into what I said earlier about why I think that none of the arguments for Christianity would indicate a God more than a not God, because it seems like I could just mirror that exact same argument and say, we can just skip the God and say the purpose is in the universe, either intrinsically or unexplained as a brute fact or whatever. And it seems like we have an equivalent claim of purposefulness now, because either the purposefulness comes from a God, which it's in God inherently unexplained, or it comes from a universe and it's in the universe inherently unexplained. And so to claim that God provides a better explanation for the purposefulness seems to be false, because it seems like your explanation of the purposefulness is a kind of a brute fact that comes from God's nature would apply equally well under naturalism, and say it's a brute fact under naturalism's nature.
So you're kind of saying that hypothetically the universe could have some sort of inherent purpose internally. I don't quite get where that would come from. I mean, it just kind of, yeah, that's the same kind of, that's almost the same claim as I'm making.
Right? Yes, it's exactly it. I'm literally taking the claim you're making about God.
Yes.
Saying God grounds purpose in some uncreated way and saying, well, I can just take that and apply it to the universe. I don't need the God. And since it's the exact same argument, it wouldn't make sense to say that God provides a better explanation of purposefulness, because I'm literally doing the exact same thing for both worldviews.
Right. I mean, sure, like that's also a valid worldview, in that, like, just as the nihilistic view that there is no purpose is also a valid worldview. Like, all of these are valid worldviews.
Well, my contention here isn't that it's not a valid worldview. It's more about your specific claim earlier that God provides a better explanation of purpose in some sense. Because in your explanation, you have this entailment of It exists in God's nature somewhere, which would be the exact same argument that would apply on a naturalistic worldview. And so it wouldn't make sense to say that it's better explained under a theistic worldview. It seems like they be explained equivalently. And so having the argument that God explains purposefulness, but naturalism doesn't, would seem false, because the way in which you explain purposefulness would apply equally under both worldviews. So they would both equivalently explain purposefulness.
Yeah. So I wasn't trying to make an objective argument that that is the case. I was trying to say that I personally have found that the most comfortable explanation of purpose that I have found. So I'm not saying that there aren't other explanations that could be valid, but this is the one that I have come to, and these are the reasons why I have come to it.
Well, so what would your reason for prioritizing that God would be a better answer than naturalism, given that I can use the exact same argument for naturalism?
So, well, if you were to claim that, so we've kind of almost got three competing worldviews here: the Christian worldview, the naturalistic non-nihilistic worldview, and then the naturalistic nihilistic worldview. So the kind of one that you've just articulated then is kind of the naturalistic non-nihilistic worldview, where naturalism is true, the universe is the only thing that exists, and there's somehow some sort of inherent purpose to that. I don't know, like in that worldview, how do we come to understand the purpose? How do we know what it is? Like it just seems to be ethereal. I don't, yeah, like the Christian worldview says we know what purpose is because we have the person of Jesus as an example. I don't see how you come to know what purpose is in a naturalistic, non-nihilistic worldview. It may as well not exist at all.
Well, how is that different from the argument that in the Thor worldview, Thor explains lightning in a way that's understandable to us, whereas the naturalistic explanation doesn't exist yet, thousands of years ago. Therefore, we should believe the Thor explanation.
The difference there is that the question of Thor versus meteorology is one of natural truth in that it can be measured, and so we can experimentally verify, that our meteorological predictions are actually valid. Whereas, the question of God versus naturalism is a spiritual truth claim in that it's inherently not objectively measurable. So we can't use those same tools to compare them.
Well, so I'm making the argument from the perspective of thousands of years ago, prior to our ability to test anything related to lightning.
Yeah.
And so in that case, it seems like a God of the gaps. We can't understand this. God makes sense, therefore God.
Right. I mean, that's why people believed in those sorts of pantheons thousands of years ago.
But is that rational? Is that a rational reason to conclude Thor exists because there isn't a natural explanation? This makes sense to me, therefore it's true.
That's a good question. I think we're imposing our modern understanding of rationality on people to whom that would be foreign, in that, like, science in the capacity we have it today didn't exist back then. So I don't, I don't.
Well, the question is more, their reason for believing seems to be a God of the gaps fallacy, argument from ignorance.
Right.
And that seems irrational from the knowledge we have today. And so wouldn't it be equally as irrational to be using the same argument to justify belief in Jesus or any other God?
I'm almost wanting to, like, give credibility to the old pantheons and the way that, like, and the way that those people believed in them and used them, in that, obviously today we know that those explanations are false because we have superior explanations to them. And I think in the same way, society thousands of years in the future will probably have far superior explanations for things that we don't currently understand.
And couldn't purposefulness be one such thing? Like it could be a natural law that we just haven't discovered yet, or something along those lines. We just don't understand it.
I mean, hypothetically, it could, but from our perspective here in the year 2025, I don't see, I can't even conceive of such a thing, and so I think it's more helpful for us to treat purposefulness as something that can't be objectively measured, because I can't even conceive of a way of measuring it.
So if it can't currently be measured, then it seems like you're using that as the evidence. It can't be measured by known means, therefore God.
Almost. So what I'm saying is we can't measure this by by known means, so we treat it as a spiritual truth claim, as something that can't be objectively measured. And so I'm not arguing therefore God objectively exists. I'm arguing, well, not so much arguing, I'm kind of saying that I've looked at these competing truth claims, and when it comes to competing spiritual truth claims, the important question is not what is true, because almost by definition, you can't establish truth or falsehood of a spiritual truth claim. The more helpful question is, how do we live our lives today? How can we kind of structure our lives in a way that is consistent, coherent, and conducive to flourishing? Like, what is the best way to live our lives in light of these competing truth claims? I don't know. Have you ever thought about it that way, or?
Not exactly, because I don't know how that would be relevant to the question. Like, if I can come up with a story and that story can help me to act in such a way that it produces, say, beneficial or either evolutionarily beneficial or societally beneficial tendencies, that doesn't indicate the truth or rationality of what the story.
No, it doesn't. But it's still helpful.
Sure, by definition.
Yeah. But sometimes the question of ultimate truth is actually not the most helpful question, especially when, almost by definition, we can't answer it.
Sure, but if we're only answering the question, what is useful or what is convenient for us, then that as a reason to believe is fine. But that would be different from the question of someone who's interested in what is actually true, what is rational to believe. Is it rational to believe it's true, independent of just it's useful or convenient?
I mean, it has to be. So, yeah, again, I see it as a two-step process, right? The first step is it rationally plausible, right? So obviously believing in, the old Norse pantheon to understand the universe is not a plausible, consistent, coherent worldview, because a lot of the predictions that it makes, like the explanation of Thor sending lightning because he's up in the sky somewhere, like that is explicitly contradicted by naturalistic science that we have today. So you've got to kind of pass the first step of like, okay, with regards to natural truth claims, is it consistent with everything we can observe and measure? And if the answer to that question is no, then you can discard it. If the answer to that question is yes, the worldview can be consistent with what we observe in the world, then I actually think you can't, if you've got competing worldviews that are both consistent with what we observe in the world, you can't actually prove which one is correct. And so trying to make arguments as to which one is objectively correct is kind of a fruitless exercise. And so once you've passed that first step of, yes, this is a rationally consistent worldview, then you can start to ask, okay, which one of these rationally consistent worldviews do I want to structure my life around?
Well, I would say there's more to it there, because rationally consistent, or doesn't have logical contradictions, doesn't seem to be like the criterion we should be using. It seems more like I think we should prioritize things that are combinations of principles, particles, laws, things that have been demonstrated to make successful predictions. And if you're adding in something new that hasn't done that, that seems like unnecessary or irrational to do that. And it seems like in the case of theism, that's what's occurring, is you're taking a huge addition of a bunch of other properties of supernatural stuff that hasn't been demonstrated to exist. Whereas naturalism is just adding in the stuff that has been demonstrated to exist. And so it's more rational to conclude that's true, because it doesn't have any of these extra stuff that hasn't been demonstrated yet.
So I agree with your characterization of Christianity. I disagree with your characterization of naturalism, because I do think it's important to note that, like, the assumption that there is nothing there is nothing acting on this world, that isn't naturally observable, experimentally observable, that is an untestable assumption. You can make an argument as to why it's a reasonable one, and I'm not going to disagree that it's a reasonable assumption to make, but I think it's a spiritual truth claim in the same way that any religion makes spiritual truth claims.
All right, I'd never claim that there's just nothing else out there. I'd say there's no reason to believe there is yet, and so it's irrational to conclude that there is. And so we conclude naturalism not because we've disproven that there's other stuff, but just because there is no reason to believe other stuff exists yet, where we do have lots of reason to believe the naturalist stuff exists.
Right. And I mean, I don't have a conclusive argument against that. All I have to say is that in my personal experience, the argument of purpose, which is not explained by naturalism, leads me to seek non-naturalistic answers to that question, which I have found and I find quite helpful in structuring my life. And I have friends who don't go seeking for those sorts of answers, who don't go asking those sorts of questions, and they seem to lead purposeful lives as well. So I don't know.
Well, do you see my challenge with that? Because it does seem very much like an argument from ignorance, and I wouldn't see that as a rational grounds to justify a belief.
I don't think it's an argument from ignorance. I think it is, I do start with a naturalistic worldview, in the sense that, like, if I'm to ask what is true, you start with your senses, what you can see, hear, and observe, right? And that leads to, from everything I've learned growing up in our day, that leads me to understand the scientific method and all of the things we can understand about our universe through that, which is, quite a beautiful thing. But it does, for me, I still have unanswered questions about the purpose of the universe that a naturalistic worldview just does not have the tools to answer. So, like, I don't think I'm being ignorant in searching for answers to those questions.
Oh, sure. So, but I would say that positing a new tool that hasn't been demonstrated to exist and saying that this new tool exists in theism, but not in naturalism, doesn't make sense to me, because I could just posit the tool in naturalism as well. And so it seems like there's a double standard where you're limiting naturalism to things that have been verified. Like you can just make up a new law of purposefulness in the natural universe, because none of the current natural stuff seems to be able to explain purposefulness. But it seems like you're doing that in the case of supernaturalism. And that doesn't make sense to me as a rational argument, because it's like, if you're allowed to add in this new thing that doesn't have any naturalistic evidence in the supernatural worldview, well, we can just do that in the naturalistic worldview as well. And it seems like that would be a better starting point, because more of the naturalistic universe has been demonstrated to exist in the first place.
Right. So, yeah. So you're kind of saying is that, like, everything we've known to exist has existed within the confines of the natural universe, and therefore everything we should expect to exist, we should also expect to exist within those same confines of the natural universe.
Well, not exactly, no. So your critique of the naturalistic worldview is that it doesn't have the tools to explain purposefulness. And well, what do you mean by tools? In this case, tools seems to imply the things that have been accepted to exist in the naturalistic worldview can't be used to combine in such a way to produce purposefulness, which I would agree to. There's no like principle of purposefulness or particle of purposefulness. But then you're saying theism has this extra tool. And this extra tool is, you have asserted a new kind of thing without, it seems, any kind of natural evidence. And the argument is, well, I can just do that under naturalism too. And so this tool that you're using of asserting a new kind of thing that doesn't have any naturalistic evidence, well, naturalism has that tool. That's not a tool that doesn't exist for naturalism. It's just we just don't do it because it's not within not what we accept as a rational methodology to produce true beliefs. And so you've made the claim that you have a tool that we don't have access to under naturalism, but it seems like we do have access to that tool, and we could use that tool in the same way that you're using that tool, but we choose not to because we think it's a bad tool. And so why is it in your case that you think that this is a good tool to use?
Right.
And because we could just use it under naturalism, if it's a good tool, why don't we just use it under naturalism? And wouldn't that be a preferable hypothesis to using it under supernaturalism?
Right. So when you say kind of the extra tool, I'm kind of bringing back to like the framework that I'm trying to write about, of, you know, natural truth versus spiritual truth. So naturalism is able to answer questions about natural truth. Naturalism is able to answer questions about natural truth as in objectively measurable claims, whereas you know, spiritual truth claims are by their nature not you know, not measurable. And so you're saying that within a naturalistic worldview, you can still answer spiritual truth questions. You can still answer non-objective questions or not objectively measurable questions. And I would agree with that. You know, the new atheists like have said that, you know, atheism is a very bad model on itself for structuring human society and morality, right? You need non-natural truth to, like, how we should structure society, how we should structure morality is inherently a question of spiritual truth. So you need non-naturalistic tools to answer those questions, right? So yes, in a sense, I agree that that's a thing you can do. I would reject the characterization that I'm bringing in something new. In fact, you know, I'm bringing in something older than what atheism has, in that, you know, we go back to the historical foundations of Christianity, and a lot of the modern ideas of secular humanism and things like that have come from a Christian culture, a Christian worldview. And so, in a sense, they're actually borrowing the tools of Christianity to answer those questions, in some sense.
Well, the new thing I'm referring to is you say that naturalism can only answer things about what's measurable, and the supernaturalism can answer other things that are not measurable. How are you answering those questions? It seems like you're answering those questions by essentially making it up. You have an idea, a story that explains this fact, and that's it. Like, could naturalism make up a story that could explain this fact? Like sure, we could say there's magical fairies that do stuff in the natural world that are unmeasurable. We can make up a story to explain these things. And that seems like that's the tool that you're using, is that when you're answering these unmeasurable questions, the tool you're doing, the way that you're doing that is by essentially making it up a story.
Right. And you're arguing that you could make up a new story and that would be just as valid. And this is kind of the problem I have with the you're probably familiar with the idea of the giant spaghetti monster. It's, in a purely logical sense, it is kind of this, like, kind of valid in the same sorts of ways, in that it's an untestable story or what have you. But I think it is important to recognize that, like, that is a movement that is intentionally satirical. And so I think that means that's a bad reason to believe in that story. I think you making up a story about fairies is a bad reason to believe in it, because you've just made it up. Whereas for me, I have these questions about purpose, and I've gone looking for answers, and I've found, I haven't made these up. I've found stories from about 2,000 years ago where people claimed to have seen the person of Jesus of Nazareth resurrected, and I can't be certain of their motivations for making those claims, but I can look at the fact of how many of them were martyred for what they believed to, what they claimed to have seen, that they could have, if they knew that what they were peddling was a lie, they could have very easily given it up, but they decided to to push on, and they were executed for it. And to me, that gives credibility to the idea that they were at least motivated. They had some level of belief in what they claimed. And so to me, that's a more plausible claim than someone who's just made up a story to be satirical.
So, but the tool seems to be the same. Like, I don't understand the relevance of the story being created now versus 2,000 years ago. Because your original argument is that you have this extra tool that naturalism doesn't have. And the point is just to say that naturalism does have the tool. Can people potentially have an acid trip where they have a story that comes to them that they genuinely believe about the universe creating purpose? I mean, sure. That could have happened 2,000 years ago. Does that make it more plausible just because the origin of the story is different?
Right. Like, not by itself, but then you kind of, so I'm trying to work out, I've got about 5 different directions in my head at once, and I'm trying to work out where to take it. So we're in agreement that, like, well, actually, are we? So
about what?
About kind of naturalism is able to answer questions about objective measurable truth better than any other worldview we've come across. So when it comes to questions of philosophy, of morality, of spiritual truth, you're arguing that hypothetically naturalism could answer those questions. It just doesn't. I mean, does it not answer them because you don't think they're important, or?
It doesn't answer them because the method to answer them is unreliable. So the argument is that the method that you're using to answer those questions is a method that we have disregarded because it doesn't work as far as we can tell. And that's why
Right.
we don't try to answer the questions.
So you're just happy with leaving those questions unanswered. I don't think that's quite the case, because we all have to answer moral questions, spiritual truth questions in our own lives, right? We can't. A society doesn't work if the only reason people don't do crimes is because they'll get sent to jail. Like, most people don't do crimes because they think doing crime is bad, and they don't want to hurt other people. So that that is people answering moral questions of spiritual truth which aren't objectively measurable. And so you need some sort of way of answering those questions. So I don't think saying that naturalism just doesn't answer those questions because it thinks the tool is bad, well, then clearly you know your moral worldview has to have come from somewhere, right? Where does that come from then?
I follow patterns in moral intuition, moral progress over time, make predictions, that kind of stuff. But I think the difference is I wouldn't say that. Like, I would admit that there isn't any hard evidence of objective morality. I believe in objective morality, but I don't think there's any hard evidence. So I'm just going to admit I believe it based on a hypothesis. It's just a hypothesis. It's not like a theory or a confirmed thing that has lots of evidence. So I think that would be the difference between the more naturalist view of morality and the theist view of morality. It seems like theists would claim is they have lots of evidence for God in some sense, or lots of reasons to believe in God, and so this is a good explanation. Whereas naturalists are going to admit, yeah, we don't have any evidence for this. This is just a hypothesis we've come up with so far.
Oh, I mean, I'm perfectly willing to admit that Christianity might be false. Like, it's in that same sort of hypothesis sense. Like, I think it has enough plausibility behind it and enough historical evidence behind it for me to structure my life around, and doing so has been very helpful for me. But I might be wrong. I don't think I am. I hope I'm not, but I might be, and there's no getting around that.
Well, I'm going further. I'm saying there's no evidence for this. There isn't any evidence for objective morality. It's just a hypothesis. Is that
Right.
a claim that you would equivalently make for God being the grounds of morality?
Right. Yeah, no, I don't think I would go that far with my own worldview. So
I think that's the substantive difference, is that the method that I'm coming to my moral beliefs, I recognize isn't a reliable method to indicate truth. It's just a hypothesis. You can use anything you want to come up with a hypothesis, a dream or drugs or whatever.
Sure.
But I think the difference there is that theists claim that, like you said, they have this extra tool, and that this tool is useful or good or evidential or something, whereas we think it's essentially just making stuff up.
I mean, I guess that comes back to the question of the original founders of Christianity. It's entirely possible that they were just making things up, but it's also possible that they weren't. And if they were making things up, then I'm a fool. But I think it is plausible that they weren't making things up. And if that is the case, then it's not. Yeah, I don't quite know where to go with that.
Well, the question would be is how can you differentiate the stories they made up, or the stories that they have, as being made up versus not made up? Like what kind of methodology do we have to establish that stories um, are more than just stories if X?
Yeah, I mean, we don't have any objective way of measuring that. For me, when I look at the historical evidence, we can kind of try and see what their intentions may have been. And again, like when I see the actions of the early church, I do see people who believed in what they claimed to have seen, right? And it's not like other religions, other ideologies have people who have done extraordinary things for something they claimed to have believed, like an ideology. But Christianity is almost unique in the way that it's centered around an event, a particular historical, if you were there at in 33 AD with, a camera, you could have taken a picture of either Jesus being there or not being there, right? This is something that was verifiable to the people of the day, and many people claimed to have seen it. That doesn't mean it definitely happened, but I think that means it might have happened, and if it did, that's a hugely important thing for all people over all time.
So I think then the question would be something like, 1 second, I got a cough again.
Yeah, that's all right. I hope you're all right.
So supposing Jesus, say, rose from the dead or whatever,
Mm.
and people believed it,
Mm-hmm.
why should we believe that this is indication of something fundamental to the universe, as opposed to the natural explanations we have today? Bereavement delusion, communal reinforcement, folia do. Like, we have lots of known ways that all of the things that were experienced could be explained by psychological phenomena that we have tons of evidence for. Why would we prioritize that an actual divine thing happened rather than just one of the known psychological features?
Right. Yeah. Those sorts of explanations are also plausible. I think it for me, the answer to that question comes back to purposefulness, because if this isn't able to, if these events of the first century aren't able to explain the purpose behind the universe, then I'm kind of left without an answer to that question still. And yeah, so yeah, I think those sorts of naturalistic psychological explanations of people's actions in the first century, like, they're plausible. But they once again lead us back to a naturalistic worldview, which to me, again, naturalism, nihilism, yeah, I don't know. I think I'm not getting very well with that, but do you kind of get where I'm at all, or not really?
Well, sort of yes, sort of no, because it seems like there's a big vicious circle in that it starts with, there's big unknown answers like purposefulness in the universe. Naturalism doesn't provide answers, but that's seems like an argument from ignorance. There is this substantial event in the past that seems like something supernatural is claimed to have occurred, but that can be explained by natural phenomenon. And then it all seems to loop back on itself, is that each one of those facts seems to be used to justify the subsequent facts, the subsequent arguments, but none of them seem to hold weight in and of themselves. It seems like, can naturalism provide an explanation of purpose using the same story tool? Yes. Is that less justified? Well, not necessarily, because there's no way to determine that the stories of the apostles are any more true, and those could just be psychological phenomena like delusions. And so it doesn't seem like there's a way to prioritize the stories of supernaturalism versus the stories of naturalism. And it seems it all rests on this assumption that naturalism doesn't explain unknown things, which seems to be more of a choice of naturalism because we don't think that there's a good method to do that yet, rather than an actual substantive reason why naturalism would have a disadvantage to be able to do that over supernaturalism. And none of those seem like very good arguments as far as I can tell.
So, I mean, you asked where these things don't seem to hold any weight in themselves. A lot of the weight of it comes from my own personal experience, and that's why they hold weight for me, in that my experience of being a Christian throughout my adult life. I've had many experiences which shape my worldview, and that my worldview is able to explain in ways that a naturalistic worldview is not. I do actually, no, I'll come back to that later. Sorry, I've got, once again, like the classic going in many different directions at once. Like I would be a very different person if I was not a Christian. Like, if I had no reason to, like, if I had no, like, the person of Jesus kind of gives an example of who to be, or what to be like, or how to live my life. If I didn't have that example, like, I mean, this is a fairly personal story, but like, I've always struggled with relationships, and romantic relationships, and like, if I didn't have if I didn't have my Christian faith, I could probably been dragged down into incel ideology. But having that faith that gives structure to my life and gives explanation to the world and to the hard times that I've been through, has meant that I've had a kind of model to look towards. Whereas, if I only had a naturalistic worldview, I wouldn't have any of that sense of direction. And so there's no reason not to go into that destructive ideology. And like, that would have been terrible for me. Yeah. So when you say, like, I'm giving you a very high level overview of my worldview, and each of those kind of points from the outside in a short conversation like this one, they do look kind of hollow, but each one of them has, years of experience that is kind of sitting underneath it, that's helped to build it. And that doesn't make it objectively true, but it does mean that it's quite meaningful for me and for my worldview. Yeah,
that makes sense. Like, I totally understand having an ideology that is useful or helps you to navigate life, to make decisions to have a better life. Absolutely. But I would still put that in the classification as a hypothesis. Like I think my model of morality is the same kind of a thing, in that it helps me to make decisions, to understand things. But I think in that case, it's more rational to say, like what I say is that there's no evidence of this. This is just a hypothesis. It's worked for me. It makes sense to me. It intuitively functions. It can help me make decisions. But I would say that there's no evidence of it. It's not really, there's nothing really there that can indicate that this is more likely true than false. It's just a hypothesis. I like it. And I would, that's the part where I think I would disagree with the Christians, is that they don't take that step. They don't say that it's just a hypothesis. They think there's evidence that that there's something more than just a hypothesis, that it's something more akin to like a scientific hypothesis in some way, that it has like real evidence, that it's really supported. And that's the only part that I would think I disagree with, is that having a same kind of depth to my ideologies, but acknowledging that it doesn't have any evidence seems to be more, I don't know, intellectually honest, or I don't know if that's the right way to phrase it, more intellectually consistent. And then it seems like theists are taking this extra step, that they have all this evidence, or that they claim to have all this evidence, or that all this justification that I don't think is there. I think there's lots of justification there for the hypothesis, just like I have for my morality. I think those are perfectly rational, but I keep getting lost on this extra step that they seem to be making, that there's this claim of this higher level of evidence there that I don't see.
Right. I mean, I think we're actually in a very similar position, and we're just using different words. So I'm kind of thinking back to what I was explaining before about the kind of two-step approach of like, is this worldview rationally consistent, plausible? I think there is evidence for Christianity that says that, yes, it is consistent and plausible. I don't think there's further evidence that says that it's definitely true beyond my own personal experience, right? So you asked me a little while ago, like, do I think there's evidence for Christianity, or is it just a hypothesis? Yes, I think there's evidence for Christianity, in the sense that that level of evidence brings it up to, this is a worldview that I could consider. Like, this is a consistent, coherent, plausible worldview that I could consider, along with, for me, kind of the atheist naturalist worldview is the most plausible alternative. But I don't think there's any evidence beyond that. In the same way that you've said, you don't think that there's objective evidence for your worldview, right? I would agree with you on that.
And we would probably both agree that there is lots of hard evidence for naturalism, right? That's a thing that there's tons of evidence for.
Right. So, and that comes back to my distinction between natural truth and spiritual truth, in the sense that I use a naturalistic worldview to answer questions of natural truth. By the way, I think when you use the word supernatural, I understand a supernatural truth claim as one that is theoretically objectively measurable, in that if you were in the right time at the right place, then you could have measured it, even if we don't, even if we can't measure it today without inventing time travel. It's theoretically a supernatural truth claim is one that is theoretically measurable, and so kind of falls under natural truth in that way, but it's kind of explicitly contradicts rationality of the universe. So like the idea that the universe operates to natural laws that are unchanging over time and space. So that's kind of the definition I have of supernaturalism in my book. That is separate to a spiritual truth claim, which is one that is, cannot be objectively measured even in theory. The claim that Jesus was resurrected from the dead is a supernatural truth claim, in that it could have been objectively measured, and also people don't rise from the dead under the laws of physics. That's a side point that I don't remember where I was going with. It's just that I noticed you were using supernatural in a slightly different way to how I was understanding it. So yeah, when I kind of evaluate the supernatural claims of Jesus, I kind of look at that, and then spiritual truth claims as a separate category.
So
I don't know if that helps.
Why would spiritual claims be in principle not measurable?
Well, just because so in my book, I actually define spiritual truth claims as the mathematical complement of natural truth, which is a term from set theory that basically means everything except this. So I kind of define natural truth as like, here are the things that are objectively measurable, and then I kind of recognize, actually, that's not everything. There are truth claims that are not objectively measurable. So we're just going to lump them in this amorphous category that I'm going to call spiritual truth. I'm just going to move my webcam. My roommate's in the kitchen.
Well, so I mean, there's some like mathematical claims that would be fit in that category, right? That couldn't, in principle, be measured, like Gödel's incompleteness theorem, or what's it, the Turing problem, what's the on-off problem, NP problem, whatever.
Oh, yeah. Mathematics is kind of, see, mathematics is almost like, and I say this as a mathematician, it's kind of like its own thing, in that, you know, mathematics, it's just like a logical buildup of axioms, and mathematics doesn't make truth claims so much as it just, like, you don't test mathematical truth claims so much as you just do the maths. Yeah, although there are unsolved mathematical problems. I don't know. I haven't really thought of how mathematics fits into the question of, you know, natural truth versus spiritual truth, because in my book, I'm mostly using that to answer political questions.
Well, my thought is that if we grant that definition, it seems like there would be natural facts that would be things we couldn't in principle measure. Like maybe the speed of a particle versus its position. Forget whatever.
Oh,
Whatever
yeah. Yeah. I forget what it's called, but I know what you're talking about. Like the less you know, the more you know about its speed, the more you know about its position, the less you know about its velocity, sort of thing.
Yeah. So it seems like there should.
Heisenberg uncertainty, I think.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Know.
Yeah. So it
Yeah.
seems like there should be potentially natural facts that would fit that category.
Ooh, that's an interesting thought. I have actually written a section about how quantum mechanics leaves room for God to act in the world in a non-supernatural way. I don't know if you've thought about that before, but the idea that, you know, quantum mechanics means that there's an inherent randomness in the universe means that theoretically God could act on that in a way that is not supernatural, in that it still obeys the laws of physics, but it's still God acting. And then through the chaos of our universe, all of the particle interactions, that could lead to big outcomes.
But then it wouldn't be randomness anymore. It'd only be apparent randomness because God did it or whatever.
Exactly. But it's still, to us, it looks like randomness. You know, God could potentially be acting on that he could, you know,
sure,
God could be acting on all of the randomness in our universe and you know, directing things in certain ways.
Sure.
In fact, that could be how consciousness operates. You know, we don't really know much about consciousness, what it is or how it operates. Consciousness could, you know, act on the particles in our brains and cause neurons to fire and all of that. That's just a hypothesis.
Sure. Well, those are all the main questions I have usually that I go through. Was there anything else you wanted to talk about?
I think we covered it kind of well, and I think we looped back around quite well. I think we're in agreement that both of our worldviews don't really have any, you know, hard evidence for them to be objectively true, but they're both plausible worldviews. Would you agree with that position?
Sure, like my moral one. Not naturalism, I think, does have lots of evidence, but my moral view does not.
I still think, I think naturalism, like naturalism in itself is a spiritual truth claim, right? You're saying that there is nothing outside of this universe that is influencing it, right? That's an unmeasurable truth claim, and I don't think you can prove that just by evidence, like just by what we can observe within this universe.
Well, I don't actually think that's a claim of naturalism. I think that's a straw man that's been imposed on naturalism by theists mostly. Because the claim of
Okay.
naturalism is just, this is the only thing we have evidence for. Like, it's not that there literally is nothing else. It's just, this is all that there's evidence for right now. And so there's no reason to believe anything else. So that seems to be the deeper view of what naturalism is saying. It's not like claiming there is literally nothing else, therefore we're right. There doesn't seem to be any reason for naturalism to make such a claim.
Okay, that's not quite how I'd understood naturalism, but okay. So,
because
okay.
like, why would anyone in the scientific community go the extra step to say there is literally nothing else, rather than taking the methodological step? There's no reason, there's no evidence for anything else.
Right. That makes sense. I still think so yeah, the axiom there is not that there is nothing else. The axiom is that anything we can't observe is irrelevant. I don't think that's an unreasonable axiom to hold, but I do think that it's an unprovable spiritual truth claim. It's an unmeasurable claim.
Say that again.
So that anything outside our natural universe that we can't observe is irrelevant. Is that the claim of naturalism, or that
no,
that we should assume it doesn't exist unless we have evidence otherwise?
something like, yeah, that would be closer. Is that unless we have a way to differentiate imagination from reality, then any imagined hypothesis would be the same as any other imagined hypothesis. And so
Right.
to accept one hypothetical non-measurable thing would be no difference than to accept its alternatives or its inverse or any of the infinitely many other alternatives. And so we think that's irrational. But in the case of like natural stuff, well, we have lots of good reason to believe it's there over its alternatives. And so that's why we accept it. And so the claim of naturalism is that the standard for evidence is the things that we can differentiate or have a reason to believe are more likely true than just the imaginary side.
Right. So that's kind of like a method or a razor of that you can use to kind of sort spiritual truth claims in a sense. And to that, I would actually agree that like that's a very useful useful method most of the time. But I would also definitely make the point.
What are the times where it's not?
Well, I think that kind of goes back to the conversation we've been having so far in when it comes to purposefulness and such. You know, I personally find it a very useful tool until you come to purposefulness, and then trying to use that tool leaves me with unanswered questions that I think are important, and so I start looking for other ways to answer those questions.
Gotcha.
So, but you know, for just about everything else, that's how I sort spiritual truth claims. But yeah, it that leaves me with unanswered questions. So but that I don't know if it's technically a named razor, but that kind of method of sorting spiritual truth claims is itself a spiritual truth claim in the sense that whether or not that will always sort truth from falsehood can't be measured.
All right, but that's not a measurement claim. That's a philosophical argument that we need some way
Right.
to prioritize whether it's true versus not true. And so it's not, the measurement part isn't really that important to that claim of naturalism.
Right. So the only reason I'm focused on measurement is because I'm in my kind of understanding of truth, I'm categorizing things into things that can be measured and things which cannot. And so this is a claim which cannot be measured. It's the presumption that things without I forget how you stated it. Sorry. Can you remind me how you stated your naturalistic sorting of spiritual truth claims?
Oh yeah, things that we can differentiate between imagination and reality, so that they're more likely to be true than the alternative ideas that we can come up with.
And so how do you sort those
Novel
two?
testable predictions. You say, my idea, if it's true, here's something that we would expect to see that we haven't discovered yet. And if we check and observe it, they're like, yep, that's true. And then that's a reason to believe that that hypothesis is more likely true than any of the other hypotheses that we can come up with, the alternatives.
Right. And I remember, so, but that's for natural truth claims which can be experimentally tested. But if you have a truth claim which is not measurable, how do you sort truth from falsehood in that instance?
In those cases, we would say there isn't currently a way to differentiate imagination from reality, and so we would just wait until we could find a way to do that. So we'd say, for claims that we aren't able to do that yet, we would try to make new ways. So that's what's going on in string theory and many worlds hypothesis. They currently don't have a way to differentiate, so there's none of them's more accepted than the other. And they're looking for evidence, they're looking for ways to test it.
And so, and then when it comes to questions like morality, where in order to live our lives we need to be able to answer those questions, you have a method of doing that yourself, but you accept that it's not one that has any evidence behind it.
Oh, and I'd say we don't have a way to differentiate imagination from reality in the case of morality.
Right.
We can still make decisions on what intuitively works best to act upon. And so that would be a different question, is what we can act upon would be a different set of criteria of just what feels good, what's intuitive to us. And that's totally fine. As long as you don't make that further claim of that it's actually justified to believe it's more than just imagination. Because to make that claim, you need the novel prediction standard of evidence.
Right. But when it comes to spiritual truth claims, which by definition cannot be measured, there is no novel prediction standard or experimental standard to which they can be measured. And so
I would treat it the exact same as the string theory ones. We would wait until there's a way to potentially measure it, and until then there is, by definition, no way to differentiate imagination from reality, or wait until a new methodology to do that comes along.
But you still need to answer those questions in the meantime, questions of morality, and you have a method of doing that.
Oh yeah, so the pragmatic applications, you can just do whatever you want. Anything that feels good is a perfectly fine, as long as you don't make that extra claim of that it's real evidence.
I don't remember quite where I was going with this line of questioning. I guess what I was trying to establish was actually, I have a question for you. Do you think atheism is a religion?
It can be.
Yeah.
Yes and no. So be different for different people.
Is your understanding of atheism a religion, do you think?
No.
Right. What makes it different from a religious version of atheism?
Well, a religious version of atheism would be one that has doctrines and motivations and intentions and reasons you're supposed to do stuff baked into it. My view of atheism is just there's no reason to believe in God. That's it. There's no extra inclinations
Right.
to do or not do anything. Like my morality isn't a part of atheism. It's a
Mm.
different thing. It's its own thing, which would be more like a religion. I literally made it into a religion. So, but atheism in and of itself, my understanding would not entail a religion.
Okay. So I, when I was writing about religion, I was kind of trying to pin down what is a religion. The definition I came up with, which you may accept or reject, is that a religion is a collection of stories that explain that explain purpose, and then you have a whole bunch of like morality and things that are logical, logical corollaries of that purpose. And maybe that's my I'm just realizing this, maybe that's my own biases towards, my thinking that purpose is an important question coming out. But under that definition, to me, atheism, like, it's a simple story that there is no God, there is, naturalism, and its explanation of purpose is that either is that there is none, or that we don't have an explanation for purpose. So I think of atheism as a religion in that sort of way, and that I think actually all people have some sort of story that explains the purpose or lack thereof of this universe.
Wouldn't that mean that evolutionary biology would then be a religion too, because it explains purpose as like a evolutionary byproduct?
So I'm so evolutionary biology explains kind of purpose of life, but it doesn't explain the purpose of the universe.
Or I think it explains like the idea of purpose is a thing that is a byproduct of evolution, and therefore the purpose of the universe is something that we made up as an extension of purposeness that we feel via evolution. And so I think it would be explaining purposefulness in the same way that you said atheism did, in a way.
Right. So you're saying it explains purpose in that it says this is why humans desire purpose, but it doesn't explain whether the universe has purpose or not.
Well, I think I would go further and say all purpose exists as
Mm.
a figment of imagination from evolution.
Ooh, okay. That's an interesting one. I mean, again, that's an untestable hypothesis, so I can't say that it's wrong, but I don't know. That just reminds me of the C.S. Lewis quote. If I desire something that nothing in this world can satisfy, then the best explanation is that I was made for another world. And you can argue that that's a bad argument, but I certainly find resonance with it.
I don't know about that. Like, the first thing that comes to mind is like dictators who want to change the world and say, well, this world doesn't satisfy my needs because I'm not in control of it. And so I was designed for a world which I was in control
of. Ooh. That's I mean, we're getting into politics here, which if you've got another 3 hours, I'm up for it. But
we have been going on for, I think, almost 2 hours now. But yeah, it was a great conversation. Really appreciate you coming on. Do you want to give any links or references to your works, books, or whatever else you do?
I don't have any links or references at the moment, but I'm hoping to finish the draft of my book this year if I can. It's going to be a very busy year with wedding planning and all that, but we'll see. So Truth in the 21st Century is the working title, and hopefully it'll be on bookshelves sometime next year. That's the hope, at least.
Awesome.
And
I actually just published my book on Amazon.
Oh, congratulations!
Yeah, thank you. It's
do you have
morality without God ? It's a conversation between me and another theist. We're doing like a debate in the book.
I remember that was a big question that we had when you were speaking at the conference last year.
Yeah,
and I remember you were kind of really pushed by the Greek Orthodox priest, and I must admit, I think your explanation of objective morality was quite interesting, but also untestable.
Sure,
So
sure. Well, it's not actually untestable because my claim is that it's an undiscovered law of physics. So if we just get a big enough collider, we'll find it.
Ooh, but I think for us living in the here and now, it kind of goes back to what we were talking about, like with the people and the pantheons of old. Like they had no way of knowing what we know now, and I don't know, maybe in the future something like your thing will be discovered. Maybe it won't.
Yep.
We have no clue.
That's why I say it's a hypothesis and there's no evidence yet. Just kind of.
Yep.
Like...
I mean, I suppose if that helps you make sense of the world, but I don't know. I think Christianity's worth looking into. Might explain some things that you have questions for or that you don't have answers for now.
I'm tempted to be like, yes, why did Jesus drown babies? They'll be like, bam.
Oh, goodness.
Yeah, it was great having a conversation with you. Really appreciate you coming
Good
on.
Talk to you too.
Absolutely. And I'll talk to you later. Have a nice night.
See ya. Thank you. Bye.